With the 2024 NBA season coming to a close, it's time to rank the game's best players. The question I'm answering is, if I'm trying to contend for a championship, who's gonna offer the most value at that level? For a more in-depth look at everything that went into making the list and a full breakdown of my criteria, make sure to check out episode 1. I'll leave a link to that in the description. And without wasting any more of your time, let's finish off the list. Kicking off my top 5, I've got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Shai and OKC as a unit took the league by storm this year, overwhelmingly exceeding expectations and securing the #1 seed out west. They had a very simple yet effective offensive system that was all built on Shai's incredible skill set with the ball. For years now, he's been maybe the best driver in the NBA. Elite change of pace, a super advanced handle, freakish length, balance and flexibility. I mean, there isn't a single player who can contain him off the dribble, and there really isn't anything a defense can do to stop him from knifing his way into soft spots for high percentage looks. As a result, he gets to both the rim and free throw line at very high rates, high efficiency basketball, and that's only boosted by the fact that he's one of the game's 5 best transition scorers, so when it comes to generating quality shots for himself, he's got that down. Last year, he started to really show growth as a mid-range scorer, adding some awesome counters for when he can't get to the rim, and this year he took another leap into that rare territory, producing in-between scoring numbers that can only be rivaled by Kevin Durant. This was the key in his big-time playoff performance, because their 5-out was exploited against Dallas with bigs and forwards constantly packing the paint, and he surgically picked them apart with tough shot after tough shot within 15 feet, like he was Kobe Bryant in the 2010 conference finals. And it's this versatile inside the arc scoring package that, in my opinion, gives him an argument to be the best on-ball scorer in the NBA right now. That of course applies a ton of pressure on the defense, especially with how many layups he creates for himself, and if you wanted to point to one limitation, it's that he isn't quite the most advanced passer on the planet. However, the ball is on a string and he doesn't force any decisions, so he doesn't really turn it over, and he'll pretty consistently find kickouts or dump-offs after drawing that added attention. If I were starting an offense from scratch and needed a guy to build around, he'd probably be 3rd on that list. However, some of the guys around him do bring more value away from the ball in my opinion. He's not a great 3-point shooter, doesn't move around too much, and although he is a deadly slasher off the catch, he definitely feels like one of those guys that brings significantly more value when the ball is in his hands. That lack of serious off-ball value, along with the fact that he isn't a top-tier passer, does hold him back from solidifying himself as the 3rd best offensive player overall. That surgical on-ball scoring, though, is still enough to get him in that argument. As for the defense, he feels like a guy who has a pretty wide range of opinions depending on who you ask. His steal and block numbers are ridiculously good, which when paired with OKC's elite team defense, were enough to get him some Defensive Player of the Year votes. I don't think he's anywhere near that level personally. He can be a bit funky on the ball, not always great at keeping quick ball handlers in front of him and struggling to get around screens, which as a guard does limit his value a bit. Then away from the ball, I think he has a tendency to overhelp or be a bit too aggressive at times, although I'm pretty sure most of that has to do with OKC's scheme, so I'm really not docking him for that. And actually, it's that aggression that unlocks his best attribute, some of the best defensive playmaking on the planet. He probably has the best hands in basketball, which when paired with his length allows him to blow up action all over the floor. He's also one of very few guards who offers a legitimate vertical presence at the rim, meaning he can operate like a 3 or 4 playing free safety behind the play. These things really do impact the game, so while the limitations make me a bit hesitant calling him an all-defensive caliber guy, I still think of him as a pretty strong positive. That's enough to earn him the two-way label, and when paired with his elite offense gets him into my top 5. Real quick before we continue, I want to make note of how incredibly close this section of the list is. I think 5 through 11 are all pretty interchangeable, and I really wouldn't argue against anyone putting them in whatever order. So any complaints you might have with how they're placed, just know that I probably don't disagree with you outside of splitting hairs. With that said, I do think there's a very big jump to number 4, and in the NBA hierarchy, to me, there are 4 guys who separate themselves from the pack and all have a rightful claim to the throne, depending on what exactly you value most. These are the league's heaviest hitters, starting with number 4, Joel Embiid. Joel was on pace to have one of the greatest seasons ever before going down with injury. I'm not sure we've ever seen a guy score the ball with the level of ease and dominance that he was every single night. It felt like an off game if he didn't have 40 and 10 in a game that ended by the third quarter, and let's not rewrite history on how he was being talked about during this time. It starts with the physical prowess. He's one of the biggest dudes the league has seen in a long time, then he pairs that with the fluidity, touch, and ball handling of a wing to just absolutely terrorize defenses as a scoring weapon. He can play off the ball, whether that means screening and rolling or stampeding into a drive from 35 feet out. He can isolate from anywhere as a face-up guy, turn his back to the basket. He's a threat to score from all 3 levels and the best foul drawer we've seen since peak Shaq. While making almost 90% of his free throws, truly we're talking about a game-breaking scoring presence. Now, the criticism with Joel has always been his playmaking, and this year under Nurse, I think we saw a different animal. But then because of the injuries, it didn't materialize in the ideal way. They incorporated more movement to the offense, put him in more favorable positions to map the floor, and he picked apart every covers thrown his way for 39 games. And I really wish we got to see this version of Joel at full strength in the playoffs. Like clockwork though, he had knee problems, Bell's palsy in the face. I mean, half of his touches in that Knicks series made you cringe because of the way he simply couldn't move. Yet still his numbers looked like that of an MVP, and the 76ers actually won his minutes considerably. What I will say though, is while much improved, the decision making and passing vision just don't do it for me. There were moments in that Knicks series where it looked like he straight up forgot how to play, and he turned into a turnover machine, which, while yes, is probably influenced by the injury, can't be completely excused and ignored. For that reason, I don't quite view him as one of the 5 best offensive players in basketball. The best scorer? Probably, but other guys are either more advanced passers, ball handlers, or are easier to plug into different systems. What most of those guys can't do though is defend like Joel. He's a one-man paint defense, checking all of the boxes from positioning and drop coverage to high-level shot blocking to activity and great instincts as a helper. I actually think his defense consistently improves in the playoffs despite the offensive drop-off, and that's because he's just more engaged. An engaged Embiid is probably one of the 10 best defenders in the league, which is partly why he still produces incredible statistical signals in the playoffs, like the fact that over the past 5 years, he has the 2nd highest on-off swing of the 31 players I considered for this list. I will say he's pretty limited to that paint protection, not very mobile or versatile with his coverages, and because he's not quite a Gobert level deterrent, it's hard for me to see him in a top 5 defender conversation. Still, he's one of only 2 players who in my opinion have an argument to be both a top 10 offensive and defensive player in the NBA. If that's not enough to at least consider him for a number 1 spot, I don't know what is, but some of those reservations keep him at number 4 on my list for now. As for number 3, I've got the first candidate for the title of best offensive player on the planet, and that's Luka Doncic. I just spent 2 months talking about the absolute beauty that is Luka's offensive game, so I'll keep it to the spark notes here. He's elite at all 3 levels, is an elite ball handler, can make quite literally every single pass you can think of, so to make a long story short, he's arguably the best on-ball player we've ever seen. Isolations, pick and rolls, post-ups, getting to the rim and free throw line, or torching a packed paint with difficult shot making. You name it and he can do it. Crazy enough, he was actually battling injuries all postseason long, yet still produced world-class offense against some of the game's best defenses, showing just how matchup-proof his half-court attack is. I think everyone already knew this though. People really criticized him for everything else, particularly how he didn't really adjust his game to maximize the guys around him. To me, that changed this year. He bought into the run and gun style of offense that Kidd wanted to play by grabbing and going, kicking it ahead with pinpoint outlet passes, and just getting off the ball quickly whenever there was a potential advantage to attack. He also started to take noticeably more threes off the catch, and at a higher percentage to cater to Kyrie as a floor spacer, which then in turn opened up more avenues for him to play off the catch, actually adding some serious value away from the ball. With that said, when you get to this level of player, you really have to split hairs, so I sort of have to sound negative for a second. While he does add value away from the ball, there isn't anything specific he does at an incredibly elite level in that regard that truly synergizes and unlocks more motion within the offense. When he doesn't have the ball, he's probably just standing there waiting for a catch, and while he's a threat to do a lot of things in those spots, there isn't anything he's doing to actively improve the possession. That's why he's always going to be more valuable with the ball in his hands, and why you want as many spot-up guys around him as you can possibly find. Still, because he's that good with the ball in his hands, he's one of the best offensive players ever, and arguably the best in the game right now. The real point of contention comes on defense, especially after that finals series. The Celtics made an effort to hunt for him on switches, then take advantage of his lack of quickness by driving right past him, which put the entire defense in rotation and led to open shot after open shot. That's obviously a problem, but I think because Boston was such a rough matchup with that 5-out, it made him look a lot worse than he typically would. LA tried to do the same thing in the first round, yet they didn't have that outlier spacing, so he not only held his own, he looked like a legitimately good defender. He lacks foot speed, but is incredibly lengthy, really strong, and the effort level is there. Away from the ball, he has his lapses, don't get me wrong, but he's a sound help defender, great communicator, and his size does make him somewhat of a deterrent around the rim. Yes, he looked like one of the worst defenders in basketball in the finals. No, that's not what he typically looks like. I do think he's a negative, but far from some team-altering, drastic detriment, which is why the Mavs still had an elite playoff defense. If you viewed him as a neutral and the game's best offensive player, that would be the pathway to getting him number 1. To me, he just falls short at number 3. And at number 2, that spot goes to Giannis, who for some reason just doesn't get talked about anymore. I'm not sure if it's because we've gotten used to him, but all 29 defenses know exactly what he's looking to do every single possession, and it just straight up doesn't matter. He generates more rim pressure than probably anyone since peak Shaq. He's an all-time great finisher, and as soon as you zone him up, he's spraying it out to shooters with some high-level passing. Many will criticize him for being a one-trick pony, but actually I think that's part of what makes him so good. For years, my biggest criticism of him was that he didn't lean into the running back stuff enough, settling way too often for pull-up jumpers from both 3 and the mid-range after getting sagged off. This year, he finally abandoned those dumb shots, leaned fully into being a battering ram, and it led to, in my opinion, the best offensive season of his career. He had a career high in assists, field goal percentage, 2-point percentage, true shooting percentage, effective field goal percentage, while scoring over 30 points per game. What more could you ask for? With the addition of Dame, I also felt he showcased some more of his game away from the ball. He was more active than ever on the offensive glass, was stampeding into open space as an off-the-catch weapon, diving downhill and picking apart defenses from the short roll. There's just one key trait that I cannot overlook. The guy doesn't know how to screen, and that alone made the fit with Dame a lot clunkier than it should have been. If he would just simply land hard screens before rolling, instead of these quick tag and slips, he'd be arguably the best pick and roll partner in basketball, putting the defense in rotation every single time down the floor. The pick and roll between Dame and Brook actually looked more effective as a result of this, and he's never been a super high feel off-ball player to begin with, not filling out space or floating along the baseline like a traditional big, which when paired with his complete lack of shooting leads to some awkwardness. Much like Joel, his strengths are so amazing that he's one of the game's best offensive players off of that alone, but the limitations bring him into the back end of the top 10 for me. Also like Joel, he makes up that ground with two-way play. I'm not sure how much of this can be attributed to the situation around him, but this felt like a big down year for him defensively, just in terms of effort, activity, and overall playmaking. And I think it's a shame that we didn't get to see him in the playoffs. He may have just turned up and looked like his 2022 self, which maybe would have solidified him as the best player in the world. Because a fully engaged Giannis is one of the best defenders ever. His range as an athlete and a helper behind the play, the way he grew into a versatile pick and roll big who can execute drop coverage, come up to the level, and pretty seamlessly switch across the board if that's what the team needs. He can play the 3, 4, or 5 depending on how the other offense is operating, and he allows for so many different lineup choices that this current installment of the Bucks just can't take advantage of. But I know what I saw in 2021, and I know that's still in there somewhere. So while I don't think he has an argument as the number 1 defender right now, I still think he's in that top 5 discussion. Again, a top 10 offensive and defensive player will always have a claim to the throne, although to me, there's just one guy who eclipses him. That of course is Nikola Jokic, who might just be the most complete offensive player ever. Throughout this list, I've talked about all sorts of different offensive engines, ranging from ball-dominant perimeter creators to big-time volume scorers, from elite passers to high-level off-ball guys. Jokic is the one who has the entire package. He's the best post scorer since Shaq, is maybe the best passer since Magic, is an elite screen and roll partner, shoots 60% from the mid-range and even better on floaters, so don't think about packing the paint, and he's constantly moving without the ball, whether that means cutting, filling out space, or crashing the glass. That's why his efficiency is always so high. Even against a Minnesota defense that was carefully crafted to limit his game, he averaged 29, 11, and 8 on 60% true shooting. He's scheme-proof, he maximizes everyone who shares the floor with him regardless of their style of play or talent level. Truly, he's just the perfect offensive centerpiece. If you wanted to make a critique, his three-point shooting was way down this year, especially in the playoffs, and if that's a serious regression, we could revisit this discussion next year, but I'd argue that has more to do with variance than anything, and defenses are still going to treat him as a shooting threat, which in turn opens up the floor for those screening actions and cuts that makes their offense so great. As for the other side of the ball, this is definitely where he draws the most criticism. I'll be the first to admit that most of the Lakers series and the first couple games of the Wolves series looked bad. Absolutely zero resistance in the paint, low activity. I mean, it looked like a layup line for the opposing team. However, when they did need him to engage, they turned into an impenetrable defensive unit. In fourth quarters against the Lakers, they were bottling them up. In the last 5 games against the Wolves, they were consistently holding them below 100 points. And a lot of it starts with what Jokic does well. No, he isn't a vertical presence or a mobile pick and roll defender, but he is incredibly good positionally, especially when it comes to playing up at the level. Ant couldn't create anything out of pick and roll because he was running into the brick wall that is Joker, and that forced the offense to play a lot more ISO ball than they're typically accustomed to. He's also just huge, incredibly lengthy, and has amazing hands, so he does clog up a lot of stuff inside the arc. I understand why many would be low. A non-rim protecting, non-switching 5 does make for some difficult decisions with roster building, but I do still think the strengths are enough to keep him from being a true liability. You could argue he's a negative, I wouldn't be mad at it. I, however, lean more towards the neutral side. Neutral defense to go along with all-time great offense is enough to earn him the #1 spot in 2024. Just to recap my top 5, I had Jokic at 1, Giannis at 2, Luka at 3, Joel at 4, and Shea at 5. I appreciate each and every one of you who watched the videos all the way through, and I can't wait to hear what some of your lists look like in the comments. If you enjoyed this series, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and turn my post notifications on to be first on more content. If you're interested in my more in-depth research, make sure to check out my website and social media profiles. You can find those links in the description. As always, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.